Hello everyone, my name is Henry Ng, and this is my dissertation review presentation for DPA 760. The dissertation that I am reviewing is titled Loss in Translation: How Bureaucratic Hierarchies Limit Presidential Control over Distributive Policymaking in United States Federal Agencies. This dissertation was written by Dr. Matthew Zarit in 2018 at the University of Pittsburgh. The link to his dissertation can also be found below. The idea of using contractors in the United States government is not new. In fact, contractors were used during the days of the Revolutionary War when wagon drivers were hired to provide supplies like beef, clothing, and weapons, as well as providing basic engineering services. It wasn't until 1949 that a president's role is defined as a principal agent for purchasing goods and services for the federal government. Powerful as a president may be, the task is impossible to be done by one person. Hence, it is routinely delegated down the chain of command until contracting reaches the appropriate level. Typically, only when things go wrong is when we hear about it. One of the more recent examples in history is the Halliburton Company and one of its former CEOs, former Vice President Richard Cheney. According to its website, Halliburton is a global company that provides products and services to the energy industry, with Mr. Cheney serving as its CEO from 1995 to 2000. Although Mr. Cheney left his post to become President Bush's running mate, his influence remained. Halliburton had its share of troubles: alleged business dealings with the US-backed sanctioned Iran, an alleged bribery scandal in Nigeria, proposed termination of promised health benefits for its retirees, but perhaps its most infamous controversy is the work in Iraq. In 2006, concerns grew from the Democratic House Committee on Government Reform regarding how companies like Halliburton, which had direct links to the president, received lucrative contracts yet had allegations of waste, fraud, and abuse. This begs the question: is it possible to pay to play in the federal government? And if so, how much influence can the president, as given the legal authority to award contracts, have throughout the different departments and agencies? This is the focus of Dr. Zarit's dissertation. His work explores the influence of organizational hierarchies within federal agencies and how they limit the influence of presidents on decision-making within bureaucracy. Dr. Zarit also introduces his theory of vertical insulation. Using contracts as a sample, he suggests that due to presidential influence, vendors will receive larger contracts in the top levels of agencies, but this influence will dissipate as it traverses down. The dissertation also considers if agencies function organizations that can both facilitate and inhibit political influence on decision-making. Before we can continue, though, there are a few things to review for Dr. Zarit's study. The Hatch Act of 1939 and Federal Election Campaign Act of 1976 both prohibit those who sign on an official federal contract from donating, but there is no such requirement for other employees working in that contract. What this means is that in reality only a few people are legally barred from donating. Contractors are also free to form political action committees and contribute. In the year 2000, Halliburton donated over $500,000 to the Republican Party throughout the United States. As Dr. Zarit states, the idea of giving campaign money with the goal of influencing government contracts is often referred to as pay to play and represents a side of politics that is often assumed but is difficult to prove. Dr. Zarit also focuses his study on contracts instead of grants for several reasons. First, contracts and grants are fundamentally different. Grants are a lot more rigid because the intention is to extend the work of the government in an official capacity. Its formation as a separate budget item and characteristic of being reviewed by either the president or the legislature mean that it is also very susceptible to their influence. On the other hand, contracts are part of an agency's discretionary funds where it does not require legislative approval. Contracts are also decided by the agencies themselves. In his study, Dr. Zarit focuses his attention among three levels of hierarchy in the federal government: the executive level, managerial level, and field offices. As expected, the executive level is the most politicized due to their close proximity to the president. Other members include high-level agency secretaries, deputy secretaries, and members of the senior executive service. On the managerial level, despite their offices being in DC, they are hierarchically distant from the top of the agency. Dr. Zarit expects that there is less political influence at this level. Lastly, field offices are both geographically and hierarchically distant from top agencies, spread across the United States. Dr. Zarit expects that if field offices do experience some sort of political influence, it is highly unlikely from other sources aside from the president. With this basic understanding, we now look at Dr. Zarit's research questions. There are 3 research questions Dr. Zarit proposes to answer. First, all contracts will be examined to determine if the broad pattern of vertical insulation exists. Second, the specific mechanisms within contracts, such as the bidding process and pricing structures, are analyzed to see if organizational insulation can be subverted. Third, the effects of contract size are used to understand if political influence is strongest on the largest contracts. There are some limitations that need to be addressed. First, there must be the assumption that the president does indeed want to direct federal contracts to campaign donors. There is evidence suggesting this claim. Prior to the congressional elections in 2007, contracts were awarded to some vendors in key swing areas. It is also expected that most of the influence occurs at the executive level because political messages get diluted as it travels down the hierarchy, resulting in a lack of control. Dr. Zarit also chooses to use departments and agencies rather than hierarchy as a decisive factor in presidential influence because control can be better understood in this way. While Dr. Zarit's research method is technically a mixed methods approach, the overwhelming majority of it is based off a quantitative data secondary approach. For his study, Dr. Zarit retrieved data from usaspending.gov, an official United States website managed by the Department of the Treasury, and Political Action Committee information from the Federal Election Commission website. Interviews, a primary source of data, were also conducted by Dr. Zarit, which does seem to supplement his quantitative data. However, there is no questionnaire attached in his dissertation, nor was I able to track down a copy by the time of this presentation. Dr. Zarit has 3 sets of hypotheses in an attempt to answer his research questions. In his first set, Hypothesis 1 is higher level offices in the bureaucratic hierarchy will provide larger contracts to presidential donors regardless of the amount of the donation than in the lower levels. Hypothesis 2A, the influence of campaign contributions by vendors will increase over the duration of 8 years of a president's term in executive level offices. Hypothesis 2B, the influence of campaign donations by vendors will be seen close to the presidential election in years 1 and 5 of an 8-year term. There are 4 hypotheses in the second set to see whether or not presidential influence can overcome the hierarchy in federal agencies. The first hypothesis is vendors who donate to the president will receive greater advantages on no-bid contracts in the middle level of agencies. The second, vendors who donate to the president will receive greater advantages on competitively bid contracts in the executive and field offices. Third, vendors who donate to the president will receive greater advantages on cost reimbursement contracts in the managerial level of agencies. Fourth, vendors who donate to the president will receive greater advantages on fixed firm price contracts in the executive level and field offices and agencies. In the third set, the first hypothesis is larger contracts will be substantially larger for donors compared to non-donors, regardless of their place in hierarchy. Second, smaller contracts will only show advantages for donors in high-level offices, but not in middle and lower level offices. Hypothesis 3A. Donors will be more likely than non-donors to be awarded multi-year contracts regardless of the hierarchical origin of the contract within the agency hierarchy. And hypothesis 3B. Donors will be awarded longer contracts than non-donors regardless of the hierarchical origin of the contract within the agency hierarchy. In all three sets, Dr. Zarit's population are the federal departments and its agencies, with the sampling frame being contracts awarded within this population. Also included in the sampling frame are contract officers and commissions. Dr. Zarit retrieved almost 1.3 million contracts from 2001 through 2016 from the website usaspending.gov and PAC's campaign contributions gathered from the FEC. In the first two sets, the data provides critical information that coincides with Dr. Zarit's research in the three levels of hierarchy. Basic information such as agency names, departments, and contract amounts are included, but more importantly, offices where the contract originated from and the signage dates of the contracts provide key information in determining whether or not political influence takes place. Dr. Zarit used the fuzzy match algorithm in Microsoft Excel to further organize his data and then manually checked again for accuracy. In his third set, Dr. Zarit uses an unconditional quantile regression method to help estimate the relationship between the variables and different contract values set at specific quantiles. Additionally, the Poisson-Loggett maximum likelihood model is used when analyzing multi-year contracts along with ordinary least squares models. So what did the results show? Dr. Zarit's research validated his first set of hypotheses. Data shows that donors do receive substantially different benefits from the executive levels down to the field offices in the form of contracts. Additionally, donors receive significantly larger contracts than non-donors at the highest levels. The dissipation is also not gradual, as there is a noticeable drop from the executive level to the managerial level and a similar result from the managerial level to the field office level. Dr. Zarit's research suggests that a great amount of influence occurs at the executive levels. His research also shows that campaign contributions do not follow an electoral cycle. Instead, it is suggestive that contractors donate money over time as an administration becomes more familiar, and over time do vendors receive larger contracts. Before we delve into the results for Dr. Zarit's second set of hypotheses, we must first understand the three characteristics of a no-bid contract. First, a contract can forego the competitive process if only one vendor can provide the service. Second, if a contract is being awarded to address an emergency situation, and third, if disclosing the contractor would jeopardize national security. Furthermore, no-bid contracts are supposed to be limited to 1 year. While this may prove to be an attractive option for agencies, it also poses problems for the government if vendors are not properly vetted. With this knowledge, we can better understand the results for Dr. Zarit's second set of hypotheses. Dr. Zarit's research answers only two of his hypotheses. Hypothesis 3 proved to be inconclusive. While data does lean favorably in advantages for donors at the managerial level, the findings were not significant enough for Dr. Zarit to definitively state so. Hypothesis 4 is also dispelled at this time. In regards to firm fixed price contracts, donors received greater benefits than non-donors at all three levels, with the executive level being dramatically larger. None of the hypotheses are validated in this third set. In hypothesis 1, generally speaking, larger contracts give a reciprocating advantage to donors than non-donors at the executive and field office levels, but not at the managerial level. For hypothesis 2, research shows that executive level offices are primarily interested in large contracts. Lastly, data showed that multi-year contracts had no significant difference between donors and non-donors in place in the hierarchy, suggesting that this is not a component of contracts that benefit politically connected vendors. Now let's take a look back at the research questions. From his research, Dr. Zarit has shown that there is a broad pattern of vertical insulation. I will also say that no-bid contracts is a specific mechanism used to subvert organizational insulation. However, the probability of success is a different story. Last, contract size does not affect political influence proportionally. As seen in the previous slide, for example, the executive level only seems to care about the large contracts while disregarding the smaller ones. First, let us acknowledge that Dr. Zarit's study was able to suggest that a federal agency's hierarchical structure can limit presidential influence within bureaucracy, and it can also facilitate and inhibit political influence on decision-making. Dr. Zarit's study joins findings similar to researchers Whitko and Bromberg. Whitko examined a sample of contributions to federal candidates by contractors and found that contractors who donated more money received more contracts than others. Whitko looked largely at donations to congressional candidates and only at the number of contracts instead of the dollar value. Bromberg did a similar analysis, confirming Whitko's findings. However, Dr. Zarit's study further contributes to the existing literature by introducing the vertical insulation theory, but also shows that the strongest benefits are delivered in the highest level of agencies. While Dr. Zarit's dissertation is impressive, there are things that warrant further research. For example, more consideration should be given to understanding how the differences between agencies specifically impact organizational insulation within themselves. Most literature focuses on the horizontal differences between agencies, while a whole slew of information can be found from a hierarchy. Dr. Zarit recommends questions such as exploring the ideologies at different levels within an agency to see if decisions can be affected. Dr. Zarit also requests that the quality of vendors need to be explored, as his work went under the assumption that it is a negative perception for politically connected vendors to be given preference over those who do not donate. Also, more research is needed to see if other factors like grants affect hierarchy the same way contracts do. Dr. Zarit's dissertation touched upon a few key concepts in our readings, and I will expand upon them. In the beginning of this presentation, I mentioned how the president delegates the responsibility as a principal purchaser. In fact, we all delegate things all the time without even realizing it. For example, we delegate the decision to make good medical choices to our doctors. As Gormley and Ballard state, delegation is a common feature of modern life. However, when is the line drawn when delegation goes wrong? In the same example, are we to blame the surgeon for unsuccessfully operating on a family member or even ourselves? How about more intangible things in the government like cost overruns? Whom will we hold accountable? The principal, the agent, or both? Not delegating at all is not reasonable either. A high-level budgeting administrator may need to delegate to their tech guru when a system outage occurs, hoping that the technician's expertise will resolve the issue. The 2006 House Committee summoning the Special Inspector General for questioning is an example of a fire alarm oversight, where legislators swing into action after an alarm is sounded, using their policy-making apparatus to bring recalcitrant agencies under control. In contrast to a police patrol oversight, the fire alarm oversight is more reactive than proactive. I am in agreement with Gromley and Balla that it is primarily due to cost efficiency rather than laziness for using this method. One hypothesis that Dr. Zarit looked into were specific mechanisms within contracts to subvert organizational insulation. While Dr. Zarit considered no-bid contracts in his study, there are definitely other methods. A president has powers exclusively to his disposal. Unilateral actions, with executive orders being the most prominent example, enable a president to make declarations that carry the full force of the law without requiring the assent of Congress. If a president were really eager and bold enough to want a certain contract, an executive order could certainly be used. As Gormley and Balla however, unilateral action is not without limitation. They can be struck down in court, or can be simply undone by the following administration. Other games can be played. Although not specific to the president, the tit for tat is just as important in talking about power and influence in our government. Holds can be placed on presidential nominated positions, all but stalling everything. In 2010, Senator Mary Landrieu did just that for President Obama's nomination of Jacob Liu to the head of the Office of Management and Budget, stating that she would not lift a hold until the Obama administration lifted its freeze on deep water oil and gas drilling. The holdup lasted approximately 2 months. The president also has authority to fire political appointees, although most voluntarily resign before it reaches this point. Usually this happens during the transitionary period between different administrations. In cases where individuals cannot be forcefully removed from government, they can be reassigned to other posts and locations. In closing, I would like to leave a few thoughts. Public organizations have come a long way, similar to how simplistic single-cell organisms evolve into complex creatures. Along with this change, so too did the bureaucracy that is anchored to it. Currently, there are growing numbers of theorists in literature suggesting that bureaucracy needs to be representative to the people it serves. In fact, representative bureaucracy was termed rather recently in 1944. Do you think representative bureaucracy is key to a more effective government in general, or only certain aspects of it? On the practical side, is bureaucracy generally helping or hindering our lives? In the case of Senator Landrieu, was her tactic acceptable under an ethical lens, moral lens, and on a general lens? Was she held accountable in her actions in helping or hurting her constituents as well as the general public? On a final note, do you think bureaucracy is needed? If so, can the stigma of a necessary evil ever be turned into something positive? Can we turn this bureaucratic anchor into a helpful tool? This concludes my presentation. Thank you all for listening. I look forward to hearing your comments and answering any questions throughout the week.